This is such...
Today, I'm here to tell the story of my evil second grade teacher because really, this is the most fitting word for her. Mean is an understatement and bully fits, but being a bully towards tiny children constitutes evil to me. What she did and probably still does to children who are barely even 10 years old is malicious and calculating. Let's just call this teacher Mrs. Witchy. Mrs. Witchy is a second grade teacher in the small town of Limtada, which I could make multiple videos on in itself. Limtada was a small town I grew up in that changed me in my formative years of life and inhibited my growth as a person. Let's just say the people there purposely go out of their way to ostracize outsiders. Mrs. Witchy denigrated us helpless children. She treated us with contempt and was downright cruel to the point of calling another student a fat ass and telling a kid who had blood running down his face to go to the office as punishment for playing too rough. Well, she asked the kid who hurt him if he really did it, awarding him with a quarter when he was honest. But those experiences are for part 2 that features my brother and another person I know who also had the pleasure of being her students. We'll see how college treats me though. Hopefully I can get this video out in time before the algorithm yeets me. I guess you could say Mrs. Witchy's classroom was almost like a microcosm of the socioeconomics of Limtada. She highly favored the elite houndspeople's children and exerted her power over the pocket of poor weird kids. Like me. It all started on a warm evening in August of 2009. It was back to school night. This was a chance for teachers to talk with parents to get to know their child or if they needed any accommodations, while the students put their school supplies in their desk. That year, the elementary school was under construction as they were remodeling it. So we temporarily had to go to school in these ugly mobile trailers a couple blocks down from the actual building. My mom and I were the first ones to enter Mrs. Witchy's classroom for the back-to-school night thing. Mrs. Witchy did not say a single word to us. She would not even look at us. I remember it being super awkward as my mom was trying to make conversation, but she wouldn't respond. Hi, Mrs. Witchy. This is my daughter, Swirlfang. This is my daughter, Mrs. Witchy. Hello? A couple of minutes later, a boy and his mom walk in, and it's obvious that Mrs. Witchy knows the mom. Her demeanor instantly changes. Suddenly, she lights up and starts fawning over the son and completely ignores us. Not that she already wasn't before. Oh, hi, Bradley. Oh, and I finally get to see him in person. Oh, he seems like such a darling boy. As soon as we walked outside of the classroom, I had that sick, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong. My mom squinted her eyes and said, I did not like what happened in there. I actually asked her about this before making this video, and she admitted she didn't share her true thoughts because she didn't want to taint my view in case she was wrong. Turns out she had much stronger opinions than she let on. I was too scared to let my mom know what was going on that year, though. Every year, Mrs. Witchy picked a main boy favorite and a main girl favorite. There was a hierarchy that started at her favorites, to their friends, other kids who had parents she knew, and below that line, well, you were subhuman. I like to call us her peasants at the bottom of the feudal system pyramid. In my year, Mrs. Witchy's absolute favorite was a girl, and in my brother's year, it was a boy. I have no doubt I was the least girl favorite. Maybe Katrina was a contender. I also have no doubt it still goes on to this day, as 3 other people I've talked to have had almost identical experiences. She evidently looks forward to this every school year. The first instance I remember is when Mrs. Witchy had Student of the Month. I thought maybe I could be Student of the Month. I tried to be on my best behavior, but I would soon find out that it wouldn't matter, as I noticed Mrs. Witchy was always talking to and about this girl named McKenzie. And the Student of the Month is Mackenzie, you're student of the month. You've been such a wonderful student. Now, Mackenzie was and continued to be a decent person when I went to school with her. She was never a mean girl and was one of the few people I actually like. Not her fault at all, and she was obviously only a child. You might think, yeah, so what? She might have just stood out as being a good student. Salty child? Nope. The trend continued down to Mackenzie's friends, Bradley's friends, and then students whose parents were part of the town politics. Her grade A pet would always be the first student of the month, like she was just itching to put them up on a pedestal in her little tyrannical world of a classroom. It would be subtle things such as this that would lead up to the major events I will get to here in a little bit. But let me first elaborate on the side of how Mackenzie was treated so you get a good idea of how impure Limtata bloodlines were treated in comparison. Everything Mackenzie would do would be the quintessential standard to be set in the classroom. Oh, you guys, look at how Mackenzie is doing it. Oh, that's wonderful, Mackenzie. Never, ever giving credit or praise to any of the rest of the students, besides maybe her friends from time to time. Every other day, we had notebooks that we would have to write a paragraph about something we would like to do, what we did that week, rudimentary stuff like that. Well, all of us would get in a line to approach her at her desk so she could grade things like grammar, readability, etc. One day, it's my turn to approach Mrs. Witchy, who wouldn't even look up at me. That was a common thing. I think I may have missed something like a capital letter and some kind of punctuation. Point is, I didn't get the full mark. You missed all this. I accepted it, as I had to, and went back to my seat. Then I kind of just sat there listening in on what feedback she was giving other students. When it came to Mackenzie, Mrs. Witchy read her paragraph and her face just lit up. She started to laugh. Oh my gosh, that's great, Mackenzie. You missed something here, but I'll just ignore that because that's so funny. Did your mom really do that? Or something like that. I remember just seething at my seat. Who cares if something was funny? It wasn't fair that she ignored the grammatical errors because something was funny. That didn't teach her anything, and it wasn't fair to the other students. During Christmas time, there are two events that I remember that really capture Mrs. Witchy's feelings about Mackenzie, if you will. The first one happened before class started, and Mackenzie gave Mrs. Witchy a gift. Mrs. Witchy was overreacting and going nuts over it. She was literally holding it to her heart, swaying her arms back and forth, and being dramatic about it. If I remember correctly, she even said that it was the best gift she had ever received, or something like that. Oh my, Mackenzie, this is such a wonderful gift. Oh, thank you. Mrs. Witchy got up from her seat and walked to the back of the class to place an ornament on her tree, which was an oval silver frame with a picture of Mackenzie in it. My brother thinks he saw the same ornament on her tree 2 years later. The other time, in December close to Christmas, was when I walked into the class kind of late and found Mrs. Witchy setting these marshmallow chocolate Santas on her desk. I even remember what brand they were. They were these right here, these Melster Candies brand. I'll throw the picture up on the screen so you guys, can see. I sat near Mackenzie and noticed she hadn't come to class even though the bell had rang. When Mrs. Witchy had noticed Mackenzie wasn't there, she paced around her desk and started to freak out. Oh, where art thou, Mackenzie? Has anyone seen Mackenzie? When one of her favorites was missing, she would do this annoying thing where she would go to their friends and ask where they were, making this whole scene of it. Do you know where Mackenzie is, Madeline? I talked to her last night. She's sick. Oh my gosh! I hope she's okay. Oh, I'll have to talk to her mom. Oh my gosh, I hope this isn't anything too serious. Oh, I wish she was here in class. So there was some background on Mrs. Witchy's treatment towards Mackenzie. Now let's get on to how wonderfully she treated me and her least favorite students. First of all, there was something minor that happened at least every day, I swear. She had to take her jabs at me and her other bottoms, while always uplifting Mackenzie and her friends in some way. It was really weird and stressful for a second grader like me, who had an intuition that something wasn't right, but I couldn't articulate it. Being second graders, I think Mrs. Witchy knew this quite well. I swear, Mrs. Witchy was bipolar. I mean, she would just have arbitrary, just strange, completely out-of-pocket outbursts of anger towards us. And unfortunately, she kept getting away with it. She cussed all the time when she was angry with a peasant outsider child. It was so common, it's really hard to remember a specific incident. It definitely happened, as 3 other people I've talked to confirmed this was something that stood out about her. The one specific time I do remember her cussing was at this kid named Monkey Boy, legal name Austin. That was a nickname people had given him because he would climb fences and usually try to be sneaky. He even pulled his pee-pee twice out in kindergarten and first grade. He was a nice kid though. Something was probably going on at home. Poor kid. Well, Austin really was a troublemaker. While we were taking a spelling test, some kid named Greg sitting next to Austin raised his hand and tattletaled on Austin.
Austin is cheating.
He was. He had been looking at the study guide paper sandwiched between his legs and the desk, trying to slyly look down at it in the middle of the test. Mrs. Witchy comes marching over and rips the paper off his desk. She walks behind her desk, reading over the paper, her beady eyes and lips tightly pursed together. The whole class looked over at Austin, and I knew bro was shaking in his britches. There was no escape from the witch's wrath. Then she yells, "This is such except she said the actual words. She throws it away and tells him he gets a 0. Then she ape yells at him and makes him put his head down for the rest of class. Obviously, he shouldn't have been cheating, and there should have been a discipline attached to it, but not appropriate to cuss at a second grader. Now we'll get into the one-on-one experiences I had with Witchy personally. I'll start with the marker story. The thing that makes it noteworthy is Mrs. Witchy's reaction to this particular incident. We sat around these large rugs where we had story times, would play games, those kind of things. This particular time we were reading from this textbook. I think it might have been a science book. We'll just go with that for brevity's sake. Anyways, I go to this whiteboard easel thing she had set up on the carpet to write down the answer to one of the questions she gave. Is ice solid, a liquid, or a gas? We were going around in a circle to answer these questions. I think my answer was correct because she seemed really mad. She had this displeased look on her face. She never seemed to appreciate when her least favorites were successful in any way, like her goal was to tear us down in some way. If we were a building block up, she'd find some way to undermine the confidence or success that came with it by insulting us or ignoring us. After I'd written down my answer, I didn't realize I had mindlessly walked away with the expo marker in my hand. So she mumbled that I had walked away with the marker. I couldn't even hear her, so I turned around and went, "Huh?" She blood-curdling screamed at me. "Didn't you hear me the first time? I said, put the marker back." A vein was popping out of the temple of her forehead, and her face was fire engine red. It was so intense, I'm not even going to attempt to recreate it because I'd probably bust a vocal cord. Just think of the angriest you've ever been. Like you just found out your significant other was cheating on you. That was her reaction to me for innocently not putting the marker back on the easel ridge. I definitely heard her that time. I just remember this dead silence over the class as I put it back. Even my peers seemed puzzled by her outburst, and actually, it looked like they felt a little sorry for me. I sat back down on my place at the rug, weeping silently to myself, wondering what I had done wrong. I swear I always saw a slight smirk on her face when she got done yelling at one of us like this. You might figure maybe I just saw it this way because I associated her with being, very mean. But there's another time I will tell you about that confirms it was not in my head. In the back of the trailers was this patch of grass. Sometimes we'd have short recesses back there or do an activity where we learned something. Our typical recesses were in some parking lot, so I really can't remember what we were exactly doing back there, but what I do remember was another outrageous experience with Mrs. Witchy. There were these two other troubled kids in class besides me. I'll just call the boy Jose and the girl Katrina. I kind of hung around them even though they were mean to me because of my shyness and quirks. Jose would always make fun of me, and I guess Katrina wasn't necessarily mean, she was just blunt. She was from North Carolina, I think, and her other siblings, all in different grades, had bowl cuts. Kind of weird random fact. Jose noticed a butterfly that landed in the grass. We were all standing around in a circle with each other. He kept making the comment that he wanted to smash it. He wanted to do something. Katrina and I watched in anticipation, and then he finally proceeded to stomp on it with his foot. Well, unfortunately, Mrs. Witchy noticed, and she did another one of her blood-curdling screams. I mean, she just went off on him. I mean, come on, it was just a butterfly. Well, most mature people don't have the urge to want to smash pretty bugs. He was a little boy, and they have those kinds of urges because they want to see what happens. And in the end, it was just a bug. I mean, heck, I'd even run over those fuzzy worm things with my bike, and I'd like to see their yellow blood spill out. There was no reason to get as upset as she did, especially when she treated us worse than that butterfly. She picked it up and cooed it like a baby. It was stupid dramatic. Well, one of the 5th grade teachers that was from the nearest classroom to this patch of open grass was Mrs. Nice. Somehow intervened. From what I remember, Mrs. Witchy was making sure she threw Jose under the bus and let everyone know what a horrible monster he was for stomping on the butterfly. I saw Jose stomping on this butterfly and barely alive. Its wings are sputtering for life. Luckily, I noticed and saved it. Mrs. Nice took the butterfly from Mrs. Witchy and used it as an opportunity to nurse it back to health. After this, we get in line and follow Mrs. Witchy back to the classroom, except me, Jose, and Katrina, who are stopped by Mrs. Nice, who pops out of the classroom and catches us at the back of the line. She kindly asks us if we'd like to see the butterfly, and of course, curious children, we obviously want to. We're probably in there a minute at most. It was mostly a quick glance and a brief explanation as to what she thought was happening. Well, we head back to Mrs. Witchy's expecting everything to be normal, until we walk in and see her standing at her desk.
Where were you guys?
Mrs. Nice said we could see the butterfly. You can even go
Sit
ask her.
down!
Usually Katrina would be the one to call out Witchy. Katrina had a rough life from what I could tell, and she had this tomboy, sort of in-your-face personality. It was cool to see her stand up to Witchy, but even she couldn't handle it sometimes. She'd put her head down and cry while I'd witness Witchy, asking her, "You will all stay here while we get to go see it." She made us sit at our seats and lined up the rest of the class to go see it as punishment, I guess. I just remember us sitting there, baffled at her reaction. Again, trying to figure out where we had gone wrong. I don't know what point she was trying to prove, but it didn't matter because we already got to see it. In fact, got a more personal experience with it. In my opinion, she was upset us non-Limtata bloodlines got any special treatment. She would not allow that, so she had to balance it out so we didn't feel like we merited any special treatment. The whole class got to see it. We weren't special. In fact, we were in the wrong for seeing it without her permission. She turned what was supposed to be an innocent experience against us. It was probably also because of the fact that she wanted to make Jose look bad. When she heard that Mrs. Nice let him see it, she was pissed because she was trying to frame Jose to look like a troubled, violent kid. Mrs. Witchy didn't care about that butterfly. If anything, Mrs. Nice did. She used it as a moment to teach empathy, while Mrs. Witchy only used it as a vehicle to make a student she despised look bad. If Bradley or McKenzie stomped on that butterfly, she wouldn't have said a word. I simply had trouble with understanding something in class one day. I clearly remember the chart laid out in front of me. We were learning about gallons, liters, quarts, cups, stuff like that. It was a large graph with this big circle or big G that represented a gallon, and the smaller units of measure were encompassed inside of that gallon. Well, I think it was something about the quarts and how many cups equals a quart that was tripping me up. I raised my hand, already nervous because I had a feeling she was going to be unwelcoming to my reach for help. She came over, explained it to me once, but I still didn't get it, so I was getting frustrated. Instead of being compassionate, having the patience to help me through this mental hurdle, or offer any personal help outside of class, the whole point of the teacher role, she slams her palms on my desk and yells like an ape.
This is basic stuff. Are you that stupid?
There was that awkward tension again. The whole class stared at me while she walked away, seeming happier than ever to continue teaching something else in class, while I cried silent tears at my desk. McKenzie and I were Girl Scouts. Really, I wasn't even a Girl Scout, but not important for now. Near the end of the year, we had to sell Girl Scout cookies, one of the whole points of Girl Scouts. And I remember sitting at my desk one day and watching as McKenzie went up to Mrs. Witchy's desk with a glossy paper chart where the customer would write down how many boxes of cookies they wanted in a cell. Mrs. Witchy laid her hand over her heart. "Oh, I'll buy 3 boxes of cookies, of course," going on about her favorite cookie as if anyone cared. The next day, I had the bright idea that I could ask Mrs. Witchy to buy cookies from me because I didn't know anyone in Limtada. So I mustered up the courage to go up to her and ask. I shyly hid the paper behind my back. My heart sunk when she wouldn't even look up at me. What? By the cold and unfriendly tone, I took this as my sign that I was not wanted, so I squeaked out nothing and headed back to my desk. So, I may potentially have Asperger's. I did have some strange habits, including stimming with my hands when I was excited. Some boy in my class thought it was weird I did this when I was excited. That's the only reason I mention it, because of this small fact being relevant to the story. This sparked the boy to make fun of me and torment me. This was the same kid who tattletaled on Austin for cheating on the spelling test. Even though he wasn't the absolute favorite in class, he was well liked enough by Witchy. He was one who knew he could use his rank against other kids in the class and would tell on the trouble kids, and knew Witchy would always take his side. He kept retrieving these erasers that had thin magnet strips on them from these bins on a shelf in class. We used them for when we used our personal dry erase boards. One day, I finally had enough and went up to Mrs. Witchy for help. "Greg keeps putting erasers under my desk. Can you make him stop?" And I'll never forget it. A smirk creeped onto her face and she burst into a fit of laughter like a mean girl. Greg and another group of kids started laughing at me too. Honestly, it's so disgusting looking back on it. How can you treat children like this? Not to mention, this reaction is so childish. Pick on someone your own age. You're a grown woman exerting your control fetish over second graders? Big F you. I went back to my seat feeling very sad and defeated. She just kind of gave him a slap on the wrist. You know what? Not even a slap on the wrist. By her tone of voice, it almost seemed like she was encouraging it. With a grin on her face, she said, Craig, don't be doing that." It kept happening. I had to suffer through it until I was finally done with second grade for good. "Everyone line up and I'll send you off with hugs." It was the last day of school, and Mrs. Witchy wanted to send us off with a hug. At least her favorites. Every kid that was her least favorite, she barely touched with a cold bye. I was behind McKenzie and watched after a whole row of cold byes. It came to her. Mrs. Witchy went nuts, hugging and cradling her. "Oh, Mackenzie, I'll miss you so much. Ooh, you tell your mom I said, yada yada." Then it comes to me. She looked disgusted to even touch me, but I actually remember feeling the release the moment her cold, lifeless fingers left my shoulder. As soon as I walked out the door, I looked up at the sun. It's like it came into focus clear, and I knew I would never be under the instruction of that nutty my horrible witch of a second grade teacher ever again. So yeah, that was my experience with Mrs. Witchy. Another thing I might add is that I remember she was very fake in front of the adult school staff. We had this student teacher aide who would come by sometimes. She was a saint. Her husband was also the IT guy of our school and got arrested for inappropriate actions towards children. That's a whole nother story. Anyways, she was having a diabetic attack and had to step outside of the class. She all of a sudden started crying and getting weirdly over emotional. And then she grabbed her some Sunny D to calm herself down. And I remember Mrs. Witchy rushed to her and was like, "Oh my gosh, are you okay, sweetie?" It was like all overly sweet and fake. It was just weird because I'd never seen Mrs. Witchy, be like affectionate or like caring like that before. At the end of the school year was also when my house caught on fire. So, such a wild time. The principal gave my brother and me book bags after that happened. He was cool. My brother's class raised money for our family, but Mrs. Witchy didn't do anything for me. In fact, Mrs. Witchy seemed a little distant from me after this fact. She never asked me if I was doing okay or offered any support. I think she was just upset I was receiving any sort of attention. Anyways, I've always wanted to open a YouTube channel. I've been inspired by animation channels and commentary channels, and I thought I'd try my hand at it. I believe I have a lot of unique experiences in my life, so I like to animate and share them. I'm planning on doing a whole series about the nepotistic town of Limtada and hope I might be able to bring awareness about this problem and to also help others know they're not alone if we share similar experiences. I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Peace.